A man of principle, a man of conviction, a man who lives and dies by the rule of law, finds himself in a world of corruption and unspeakable horrors. Torn between duty and morality, between everyday and otherworldly horrors, Roland Banks strikes out on his own path, determined to defend the world from the mythos. Hello everybody and welcome. I'm your host as always, Krabby Terror 8. And today we dive headlong into an in-depth analysis of the first Guardian Investigator for Arkham Horror: The Living Card Game, Roland Banks, the Federal Agent. Just a quick spoiler warning, this video assumes you know Arkham Horror: The Living Card Game well, and that you know things like The Gathering reasonably well. There will also be some references to fiction writings around Roland Banks, The Dirge of Reason, and also from the investigators of Arkham Horror. No specifics, I won't be giving away the stories in detail, but there will be some general synopsis there. There'll also be some out-of-context images from encounter decks, from things like the Forgotten Age and the Dunwich Express, Unspeakable Oath and Curtain Call. Examples only one card here and there, and they're not easily read, but they are there if you don't want to see them. And of course they'll be featuring a lot of Guardian cards from the starter decks, but also from more recent editions and scenarios. They'll also be featured quite heavily in this video. Now, for many players of Arkham Horror: The Living Card Game, Roland would be, if not the first, then one of the first investigators they pilot. And whilst he features in other Arkham Horror Files games, it is in this game, Arkham Horror: The Living Card Game, where he's possibly at his most accessible for starting players. With his use of standard weaponry and a special ability to pick up clues at the same time, this is, I would argue, what makes Roland so special, and at the same time why I think he's often overlooked by more experienced players, often seduced by the fancy abilities and more complex interactions of other investigators. In this way, Roland's character represents a straightforward, implacable rules-based order, not only in the game world, but in the gameplay and rule-based mechanics themselves. Now, I must admit, I'm not a massive fan of the Guardian class. For me, there's rather too much of the pragmatic use of violence in their midst for my tastes. But after playing Roland a number of times myself, I've come to appreciate him, so I'm keen to look at him more in depth with you today. Now, when I say in depth, what do I mean? Well, I mean everything, every aspect, including the historical background of his character, what it was like to be a federal agent in the mid-20s, his lore and story. What can we know about this man from the history of the time, and also what's been written about him? His core stats, special abilities, and important cards. Gameplay considerations. What are the key themes? What are the most popular Roland decks? How does he operate in practice, both solo and in multiplayer? And finally, my verdict. Along the way, we'll also hear from other content creators about their thoughts on this investigator. So let's dive in, shall we? Let's start with the history of federal law enforcement in America. Now, when I think of American federal law enforcement, I apologize straight up because I don't live in the US, so my impressions come from popular culture. I immediately think of agents in somber suits and ties, professionally trained and almost coming across as public servants with firearms. I think of people like Fox Mulder or Clarice Starling. If I think harder and closer to the 1920s, then Eliot Ness springs to mind. Ness was literally a legend in his own lifetime and famously helped to take down some of the most violent criminal syndicates in the Chicago area. And whilst Ness is closer to Roland, Ness wasn't a federal agent, and his most famous work occurred mainly in the 1930s. The first thing to note is that in 1925, which is the year of the Gathering, the FBI as an entity didn't exist, and in fact wouldn't exist for another 10 years. This is why Roland is labelled a Fed, but not an FBI agent. In 1925, the Federal Law Enforcement Bureau was called the Bureau of Intelligence, or BOI. Now, the BOI was established in 1908 with the principal task of surveying and enforcing what was called the Mann Act, which was enacted to counter what was called at the time the white slave trade. I guess today we would characterize that as sex trafficking and exploitation. So their task at that time was to audit and survey potential sites of such exploitation. By the 1920s, the Bureau would have been a relatively small and rather ad hoc outfit, populated by veterans of the war and other services, increasingly focused on crimes related to prohibition. In other words, finding and busting criminal syndicates involved in liquor rackets and related organised crime. Now, the biggest change to the Bureau comes in 1924, just before the gathering, when a young lawyer and librarian called J. Edgar Hoover takes over the Bureau and sets it on a path to national and indeed international notoriety. Hoover made a name for himself by busting commies and anarchists during the Red Scare of 1919-1920. I would refer you to the excellent movie about the life of Hoover by Clint Eastwood as a way to get a feel for what federal law enforcement was like during this period. So Hoover immediately set about making significant changes to the agency, firing unprofessional agents and setting up the country's first national crime and fingerprint labs. So it is in this context that Roland finds himself in 1925. The Jazz Age is in full swing, yet it is a world of increasing violence and criminality as a result of prohibition. At the same time, the Bureau is changing, becoming more professional and less ad hoc in its approach to law enforcement. Corruption and temptation, excess and ambiguity can be found around every corner of American life at this time. It's within this heady mix that the influence of the mythos can find its home. Anyway, enough about all that historical stuff. Let's spend some time discussing Roland's actual story. You're a riot, come on. Banks moved forward on the balls of his feet, as softly as a cat. Behind him, the larger man's footsteps sounded as loud as the marching of a drill squad. But the chanting and piping continued without a break. Whoever was there, they were too busy to hear the two men coming. The dull green glow became almost bright as they advanced. It streamed from a fissure in the side of the passage, casting enough light for Banks to see Murphy's face twitch as the terrified child called for his mother once more. Stopping the big man with a gesture, Banks crept up to the fissure and risked a glance around it. When he swung back to face Murphy, the G-man's eyes were wide, and his mouth was wide with terror. He edged back to the big man. "One man," he whispered, his voice thick and hoarse. "You take him. I'll grab the kid." His jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. "And don't look at the piping thing." Ignoring Murphy's questioning look, Banks raised his .38 and swung around the corner. Now, I've interviewed Roland myself a couple of times for the Investigator games and have read what scant information is available on Roland. I've used this to create a pen portrait of the man. What makes him tick? What are his motivations? And what key events have shaped his character? Roland is a veteran of World War I. Following General Pershing, Roland saw action in the Battle of the Marne, which represented the final attempts of the German army to break through, but instead resulted in a decisive Allied victory. Roland's return to civilian life wasn't easy. Still haunted by the violence and degradation of the mustard gas attacks, Roland found a home and stability within the BOI. Roland is delighted that his new boss Edgar Hoover has arrived at the BOI. In a short time, Hoover has fired unprofessional agents and set up a state-of-the-art fingerprint and crime laboratory. Roland feels that for the first time the agency is becoming a professional and disciplined operation, one that he'd hoped for. Evidence-based analysis now accompanies his 38 Special, or 32 in a snip. New training regimes are in play, physical and scientific. and relationships with local law enforcement is slowly improving, making it easier to get things done. But not everything has gone smoothly for Roland. A number of notable instances have left him shaken at times and questioning his own sanity. It all started with a disastrous investigation in Jubal County, Virginia, which left Roland on the outer as he unsuccessfully tried to investigate a bootlegging operation where everyone was related to everyone and nobody wants him there, leading to a reassignment onto another case. This new case is the inexplicable destruction of a Curmudgeon lake house just outside of Arkham. The explosion levelled at the house and killed more than 30 musicians, as chronicled in the short story Dirge of Reason by Graham Davis. Roland encounters unexplained phenomenon in the woods around the lake which lead him to question the very foundations of reality. The Black Cave incident in Arkham came shortly after, where once again Roland encounters familiar yet inexplicable events which leave his sanity shaken in a way the war never did. And finally, there is a night of horror and violence within Arkham itself. Neither Roland nor Miss Jenny Barnes will speak of what transpired, but Roland had discharged his service revolver a number of times within the town's jurisdiction, with no explanation. This final incident led to an inquiry by the BOI and an official reprimand amidst accusations of a cover-up of vital evidence. Which of course leads us to where we are today with Agent Roland Banks. Roland had always taken comfort in procedure and rules. As an agent in the Bureau, he was relieved to have guidelines to follow in any given situation. But lately, his Federal Agent's Handbook had been entirely unhelpful given the cases he'd been assigned. Try as he might, Roland could find no mention of what to do when confronted with strange creatures, gates through time and space, or magic spells. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he would never have believed it, and there's no way his superiors would understand. Roland knew he would have to handle this one himself. So Roland is facing what we might call an existential dilemma. In other words, does he continue to bring these events to the attention of his superiors and risk being fired? Or worse, committed to an asylum? Or does he continue to take the law into his own hands and risk further reprimands and perhaps criminal conviction? So how are we to think about Roland Banks within the context of the game and the evidence that we have? This is important because it informs the way that his character functions and the way that his investigator stats and rules interface with the game systems and processes. The importance of this complex interaction was discussed in my last in-depth video on The Gathering. That's all great, but where do we start? Where do we think about all of this? Well, the best place to start is by going back to the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages spawned a literary tradition of the knight-errant. Now, Wikipedia talks about the knight-errant as a figure of medieval chivalric romance literature. The adjective errant, meaning wandering or roving, indicates how the knight-errant would wander the land in search of adventures to prove his chivalric virtues, either in knightly duels or some other pursuit of courtly love. Modern examples of knight-errants are figures such as Geralt of Rivia, or the iconic stranger from the 1973 movie High Plains Drifter. There's Clint Eastwood again. Both of these cases feature a protagonist who is on the outer, a loner, forced to travel the world finding work outside of conventional institutions. These kinds of figures are what might be termed hero outlaws, using a system of Jungian archetypes as presented on the left. The narrative tension is how they negotiate the boundary between the two, and this ambiguity is what propels their narrative arcs. Often they begin as being considered outlaws, but by the end of the story their deeds and actions have reinforced their heroic qualities to the audience and to people within the stories. Characters who represent federal law enforcement who embody this tension would be people like Fox Mulder or Alex Cross. Roland very much sits within the same tradition. Roland's narrative tension lies between his desire to do things by the book, whilst faced with the challenges of operating outside of the law in order to save the world from the mythos. An example of this is in the book Dirge of Reason by Graham Davis. Here, Roland teams up with Leo DeLuca, a local bootlegger and criminal, in order to defeat the criminal and supernatural forces threatening Arkham. It's not by the book, but it's an expedient relationship which ensures that order is restored. The danger, of course, is that such behaviour tips into vigilantism, extrajudicial violence and murder with no oversight or restraint. This is the dark side of this kind of archetype, where the gap between good and evil dissolves, and the protagonist becomes the thing he or she is fighting to overcome. So knight-errant characters like Roland often operate within the genre of what are called police procedurals. Now, these are stories which usually feature a police officer as the protagonist who uses investigation methods to discover clues to solve the case at hand. So typically in a police procedural, the protagonist will use things like interviews, crime scene analyses, interrogations and search warrants to achieve his aims and goals. However, in order for the status quo to be maintained, the protagonist is forced to move outside of normal legal boundaries in order to liberate themselves in order to serve the greater good. This is Roland's journey in a nutshell, a man who firmly believes in the status quo of procedure and the law, but is forced to violate the boundaries of his ethics and beliefs in order to serve the greater good. It's written on Roland's face. He stares directly at you, the player, with a resolute stare, a stare which offers safety and solidity, that we are in safe hands. It's a stare which also dares you to judge his actions in the face of horror. It's a stare that says, yes, the end does justify the means, that sometimes allying with criminals and cover-up is necessary to protect the world. So Roland represents a classic knight-errant archetype found within police procedurals. His backstory is one of a journey from a by-the-book federal agent to a man attempting to maintain law and order in an increasingly chaotic and horrific world. Nate from Lost in Time and Space summarizes the synergy between Roland's stats and his signature cards nicely in this way. He says Roland's reaction ability is not only mechanically satisfying, it's also thematic. An agent who always did things by the book, Roland has to rely on his wit and 38 special to solve his cases when confronted by the horrific beings of the mythos. Unfortunately, things don't always go as planned, forcing Roland to cover up his past mistakes before they come to haunt him. So just building on those sentiments, how does all this get expressed in Roland's Arkham Horror the Living Card Game character? Let's examine this in detail as we explore his stats and abilities in Part 3. So let's have a look at Roland's Investigator card. His implacable stare as he turns up his trenchcoat collar against the rain is a perfect embodiment of his mental state. Roland's stats are typical of most Guardians. Carolyn is unusual. High physical strength with low mental strength accompanied by average willpower and low agility. Nate from Lost in Time and Space summarizes this nicely. His stat line is great. 3 willpower gives him a fighting chance against rotting remains with a little bit of guts. 3 intellect combined with a flashlight or magnifying glass gives Roland ways to competently gather clues. But his biggest strength is his combat score of 4, like most Guardians following him. So his stats reflect his personality closely. Roland is methodical and rigorous, not fast and agile, and when necessary is capable of extreme violence. His deck building options tell you that he's a Guardian Seeker hybrid, allowing him to carry classic Seeker cards such as Working a Hunch, alongside things like a 45, a machete, and a vicious blow. Vase Odin from Twisted Tentacle Inn highlights why this is a powerful synergy. He says, access to the Seeker class can make Roland a very good clue gatherer, and his Guardian access and combat value of 4 means he is already a naturally good combatant. Now on the surface, this might seem like a strange hybrid. a place between the out-and-out unthinking violence of a Zoe or a Mark on the one hand, and the bookish passivity of a Daisy or a Min on the other. So how does this apparent contradiction or paradox work as expressed by Roland's statistics and abilities? His special ability talks to this idea. Note that clues are not created through this effect, but merely discovered. Therefore, it is through violence and death that Roland learns more about the mythos and the circumstances he finds himself in. Now, this isn't the wild or underhanded violence of the survivor or the rogue, nor the practiced otherworldly damage of spells and potions. This is a practiced deliberate violence, an institutional violence with a clear goal in mind, to defend, to protect, and to understand. Roland's elder sign effect further develops this theme. Where there is evidence to discover, then Roland is motivated, indeed compelled, to act. So the seemingly contradictory interplay between violence and intelligence combine perfectly in Roland. Primarily, he is motivated to discover the truth through the gathering of evidence. But Roland is also motivated to gather evidence through the use of violence, to find information in and on and around the bodies of victims and their perpetrators. A task which takes an immense psychological toll, hence his low sanity statistic. So all this sounds like a complex interplay between head and heart, between evidence and violence. And that's the beauty of Roland. This synergy actually makes him one of the most straightforward investigators to play in the game. The reason for this is because Arkham Horror the Living Card Game, the game, rewards players and investigators for essentially two things: finding clues and defeating enemies as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So the game itself reflects and rewards Roland's MO the most. Intelligence gained through violence. So Roland combines these two goals very effectively into one ability, whereby he gains clues for defeating enemies. This leads to what is known as action compression or economy. Now, I don't want to get into action economy in detail here. Vase Odin's video is an excellent introduction to the topic. Here is his excellent definition. Every round, barring any special abilities, each investigator gets 3 actions. With those actions, you can move, attack, evade, investigate, play a card, gain a resource, draw a card, etc., etc. Whenever you can complete 2 or more of these tasks using just 1 action, or using less actions than it would normally take, it's action economy. Roland is the living embodiment of this principle. Kill an enemy, discover a clue. Every time Roland kills an enemy, he's saving himself a vital action to do something else. But it gets better than that. Roland can fill his deck full of these kinds of cards, which allow him to discover clues without taking a test, as long as there are clues available and/or there is an enemy present. Winging It highlights this awesome ability to get clues testlessly. He says, Roland is the ultimate flex who can both fight and get clues. One trap with his seeker access is to think that he'll be good at investigating. He can do it in a pinch, but 3 intellect is only occasionally good enough. It's better to get clues testlessly, either with his ability or with cards like Working a Hunch, Art Student, or Scene of the Crime. Vase Odin elaborates further. Roland's abilities not only save an action now, but save the player more actions into the future. As he eloquently states, his signature ability is a great tempo saver. Some people equate it to a free action, but I submit that it can save you much more than an action. Usually enemies can rob you of a turn while you deal with them, but Roland can kill the enemies and not have to waste an action gathering a clue. Plus, his ability can save you from having to pull from the chaos bag and risk failing an investigate test, or committing cards to a test, or even spending resources to boost his intellect or play cards that can get you the clue, all of which could normally end up costing you several actions. So seeking out enemies is something the player and Roland desire, because it leads to free actions and testless clues, an incredible efficiency of play. Now, Roland isn't the only Guardian who seeks out enemies. Zoe and Mark also seek out enemies. But whilst Roland engages with enemies to seek the truth, Zoe and Mark are gaining some kind of personal empowerment. Their engagement is selfishly motivated. They want to become stronger. Roland, on the other hand, wants to understand. Roland is motivated to seek resolution and clarity because he knows power, especially institutional power, has its limitations and corruptions. So whilst other investigators exploit or alter the game rules with special abilities and processes, they buy their way out of trouble or manipulate the cards in the encounter deck or seal away chaos tokens, Roland does none of that. His training allows him to stick to the core mechanics of the game in the most effective and efficient way possible. So now to the difficult part. Two of the key challenges with the Roland are, of course, sanity management coupled with a pretty average willpower. Only 5 sanity can mean that even in the gathering, Roland's mental stability can very quickly seem precarious, especially when the cost of sanity soak, like the Big Cop, is expensive. Kevling, Nate and Vase all comment on this weakness. It's a key issue that can lead to a quick demise. As Kevling says, you just need to make sure you bring along some horror soak, as it doesn't take much to tip him over the edge. Nate highlights just how devastating an encounter card can be. His low sanity is easier to compensate for, but an untimely auto-fail on a rotting remains can be curtains for this federal agent. And Vase shows that the impacts can stack up super fast. Actually more tricky than he looks at first glance, his low sanity means he can be extremely fragile. A single fail of a treachery like rotting remains will leave him with just 2 sanity, plus a mental trauma could mean he starts a scenario with 4 or less sanity. Ouch. Winging It discusses this further, highlighting ways to manage this horror. He says you definitely want to get soaks for Roland, as his low sanity is an issue, and his 3 willpower can be buffed, but it's not an automatic defense against the encounter deck. In a limited collection, getting an Elder Sign amulet can be worth it to soak horror, especially if he takes some trauma from his weakness. With a wider card pool, horror healing and soak becomes a lot easier to do. As Winging It says, there are lots of ways that Roland can manage his sanity, other than just by using allies as a soak. If It Bleeds is especially synergistic because it's cheap and it rewards the defeating of enemies. Vase Odin also recommends cards for soaking up dreaded horror. I highly recommend planning for sanity loss because it will happen and can end your game in the blink of an eye. Hallowed Mirror, Kerosene and Logical Reasoning are great choices for Roland, as is If It Bleeds. Roland's weaknesses are tough when compared to other investigators and impact his ability to gain vital clues. They also hit him where it really hurts, sanity. Pity the poor player who randomly draws hypochondria for their first Roland deck. Vase makes an important point about Roland's weakness. His weakness makes his low sanity even more of an issue in campaign mode, but it's actually completely insignificant in standalone mode. However, Dirge of Reason, his alternative weakness, is a different matter and is really punishing in any format. So, I suppose the moral of the story here is there's no substitute for preparation. Roland will lose sanity, and Pure Flight sums up the ideal approach perfectly. You've been warned. He says Roland's biggest setback is of course his sanity. Only 5 is a liability in this game. There are a few ways to handle his horror taking: willpower boosts, soaks and healing. His allies are good soaks for horror, but might not be enough. Logical Reasoning is a common include for him to heal horror, especially if you ever take a mental trauma and start your game with horror on you. There's some other expensive options nowadays, including something worth fighting for, Kerosene and Hallowed Mirror. And willpower boost can prevent a fair amount of horror coming from treachery cards, Chaos Bag willing. I usually include Guts with Roland along with Steadfast or Take the Initiative. I'd recommend a mix of the above to keep the Fed on the table. Now, economy is always going to be a challenge for Roland, especially with indebted on board as a random weakness. Pure Flight and Vase comment on this weakness, not confined to Roland of course, but a significant issue for those investing in assets. Pure Flight says one of Roland's setbacks is his hunger for resources. Weapons are expensive, as are the other asset toys he enjoys: Pathfinder, Police Badge, Fingerprint Kit, Hallowed Mirror. Vase says Roland suffers from being short on resources quite a bit, so keep the deck cost curve low. Assets which can be most effective will often put a strain on his economy very quickly and can leave you, the player, staring at a hand of great cards but no resources to play them. This reflects the reality that law enforcement requires significant resources to operate and can often be slow. Pure Flight has some excellent recommendations to ensure that your economy keeps humming so your dynamite blast gets a look in just when you need it. He says, you're probably best off limiting how many assets you have in your deck as much as possible and trying to include a fair number of skills to compensate. I would also include Crack the Case in addition to emergency cash to help him save up for his next big asset. So we've looked at sanity and we've looked at money. Finally, low vitality is also an issue for Roland. Less important most of the time, as Roland isn't in the business of evasion, and vitality set tests are often associated with physical damage, which Roland has more capacity to soak up. Kevling quite rightly points out that most of the time his low vitality is no big deal. He says his weaker stat of evasion isn't too much of a problem when you can fight your way out, grabbing clues as you go, and is still better than many other investigators' weakest stat. Nate highlights that this low agility tends to bite in specific ways. He says Roland's biggest weakness are his low agility and sanity. Later campaigns in the game put a bigger emphasis on agility, which can give him a hard time, looking at you, the Forgotten Age, and the Circle Undone. So there you have it, a fantastically versatile and effective investigator. Managing Roland's sanity is of course a key issue, as is his economy. But the card pool for Arkham Horror the Living Card Game has increased, which has made Roland even stronger over time. So now that we know a lot about Roland's stats and abilities, just how popular is Roland amongst players? And what kind of decks are they using? And why is he an iconic, doomed yet ultimately disposable protagonist? Let's find out, shall we, in Part 4, Gameplay. Now, I have to admit that I really only played Roland when I first started playing Arkham Horror the Living Card Game, and I have played him a couple of times in the Investigator games, but since then I've tended to choose other investigators, and it's only now that I really appreciate him more. And my own thoughts, I think, are reflected by Kevling here, who says, if I'm honest, I'd only played Roland once when I first got my core set over 2 years ago. It's easy to dismiss the core set investigators in the rush of playing the newest cards in the most recent cycles. So I just did a refresher and took Roland through Return to the Gathering and surprised myself with just how balanced he was. With a selection of Guardian and Seeker cards, he excels at doing almost everything you need to do in Arkham, handling willpower tests, killing enemies, finding clues, and as an added bonus, finding clues by killing enemies. Winging it highlights that early negative experience of dying may also taint people's views of Roland. He says Roland is very powerful, and I suspect a lot of people discount him because of early bad experiences with learning the game. Yet I wonder for some of us like myself who are more involved in Arkham Horror the Living Card Game if we aren't a little blinkered. In this awesome analysis by Andy Cotgreave, you can see that Roland is still one of the most popular investigators in Arkham DB, with over 600 decks to date, beaten only by Jenny Barnes and Zoe Samaras. Indeed, on my own channel, Roland's videos rank number 1 and number 2 out of nearly 100 videos over 2 years. Now, I imagine like me that Roland was the first investigator that many starting players use. His straightforward abilities mean he's accessible and is featured in the Learn to Play manual for the game alongside Wendy. And if you look at his starter deck tips from Fantasy Flight Games, they sum up the approach to gameplay nicely. The tips start by highlighting the key clue-getting synergy from defeating enemies. It also highlights the benefit of having Guardian allies on the table. Physical training is more debatable, however, because Roland is not one to have lots of resources handy, unless he's using Malign Christopher. The guide then goes on to suggest using and adding in testless cards to gain clues and other seeker assets, which makes things easier, especially for solo players. Finally, there's a nod to his core weakness and how to deal with it, which means that all in all the guide is pretty comprehensive, if a little overly positive about Roland's cash flow throughout the game. As Ned explains, this means he's a powerful solo investigator as a consequence. He says Roland is great at defeating tough enemies, but unlike his fellow classmates, Roland's reaction ability gives him clues when he topples his foes, making him a fantastic solo investigator. Vase also talks about solo Roland. He says, when building Roland for solo, I recommend using cards that net you testless clues. Scene of the crime, working a hunch, true understanding, and art student are great, and may be enough when combined with his ability to not have to make very many investigate tests, if any at all. I would pack lots of wild icons just in case. Pure Flight also talks in depth about his pool of allies available. He says, Roland has a great assortment of allies to choose from. While he could take Milan, I don't recommend it, as you'll usually not be investigating often enough to make it worth your while. Roland is probably better off with Beat Cop for a combat boost, and Art Student, another auto clue ability, plus a 2 Sanity soak. Charles Ross is also a cheap ally that serves as a soak and can help with the costs of Roland's other assets. It's worth highlighting that Vase makes an excellent point about Roland's signature card, something I completely overlooked when thinking about him. It's easy just to think of his signature card as just another asset like the 45, and it's not, as Vase says. His signature card is great. In a location with clues, Roland can be at a combat value of 7. Plus, having seeker access means he can search for his signature card and see it in more games than other non-seeker investigators. In other words, Roland can be built to see his signature card pretty reliably. So, taking these tips into account, how do experienced players build a Roland deck? This is an example of this straightforward, non-taboo deck build. This is the most loved Roland deck on ArchonDB by Ian_MB with a like rating of 372. Now, this deck is well loved because, well, I'll let the author explain. He says, the basic strategy of the deck is simple. Get your key assets out early, investigate when there are no enemies around, bash in heads if there is an enemy around. If there are no clues at your location, your last action should be to move where there is a clue in case an enemy shows up the next round. The main way that this deck will struggle is if your weapons are buried at the bottom of your deck. If that's the case, then find ways to get into tests that use card drawing skills you have in hand, or spend actions to draw. So there doesn't appear to be a ton of theme variation into Roland decks. As far as I can see, the main difference in his decks, looking at 3 other popular examples, is the balance between Guardian and Seeker cards. Note though that none of them use First Aid. I guess it's just too slow to be effective in most cases. I'm not sure how to pronounce this exactly. I think it's Dadu 13 on. I'm sorry if I've got it wrong, but this deck is essentially Ian_MB's deck, but with the addition of more seeker allies and shortcut to help manage clue gathering and tempo, as Roland can be a little bit on the slow side sometimes. Start with the Name pushes this further and puts in more tutoring cards like Eureka, and uses calling in favors to help manage allies and use them more efficiently and effectively. Finally, Motux really leans into seeker cards, literally making Roland an aggressive egghead. I would have thought there are more themes to explore with Roland, perhaps more in multiplayer, and Pure Flight talks about a subset of cards which don't get much love but add to his synergies. He says, with Roland, sometimes you can use niche cards that drop clues as part of their cost because his auto-clue propensities allow you to pick the clue back up almost effortlessly. Quick Study, Dr. Melson, and Forewarned are all powerful effects that don't get a lot of love because dropping a clue typically means taking another action and a test. But Roland might be able to pick up the clue you dropped without skipping a beat because he was going to play the art student or kill an enemy anyway. If you're dropping a clue on a location without clues, it's extremely easy to gain benefits from picking up the last clue effects like Crack the Case, Hawkeye Folding Camera, and Connect the Dots. Which leads me to wonder if there isn't a police procedural theme deck for Roland. One which emphasises clue management and manipulation and also management and manipulation of humanoid enemies to achieve outcomes. I don't know, it looks like a police informant card would be ideal to add to such a deck, but I don't think it exists at the moment. Whichever balance you choose, there's no question that Roland is very effective to play solo or in multiplayer, as his rank in the Investigator game shows. After playing him in The Gathering and Midnight Mass True Solo, he's second on the table just behind Leo Anderson. Indeed, I ran a quick poll on favourite investigators on the Arkham Horror Living Card Game Facebook page, and amongst more than 100 responses, Roland gathered 27 votes, putting him in second place to Jenny, which is similar to their relative popularity on Andy Cotgree's video. I then asked those who chose Roland for their reasons, and here are some of the responses. The synergy between clue gathering and fighting is a clear benefit, as we have been discussing, and shows that many players appreciate this straightforward synergy when playing the game. So as they say, his Guardian Seeker card pool brings the most classic choices for all central aspects of the game: fighting, cluing, and mobility. And he has a flexible investigator's ability that synergizes well with his above-mentioned strengths. The other more surprising finding was that Roland is considered a good tank in multiplayer. In other words, he can stand toe-to-toe with enemies and take the hits, whilst others are freed up to get on with gathering clues. So, for example, after the first few sessions we felt comfortable enough with the game to customize our decks, so I turned him into the group's tank, extra ammo, extra weapons, extra first aid. It was a lot of fun, and first Gator I played, and I always play tanks, whether I am playing an MMORPG or a tabletop RPG, so I was always going to favour someone like Roland. Reading this feedback from Facebook, I agree with Nate when he says Roland is many people's first investigator, and after some examination it's easy to see why the developers recommend him to new players. I think that on reflection it's time many of us gave Roland another spin, don't you? Winging It seems to think so, saying, "It's easy to have put Roland in the core box and not pull him out again because there are 30 plus newer investigators. But the current card pool makes him very exciting with many different kinds of builds, some leaning hard into his seeker access than others." That's all true, but there's one more thing about Roland that makes him special. In fact, he has a lot in common with a woman called Marion Crane. Why? Well, let's have a look. This famous sequence in Psycho from 1960, directed of course by Alfred Hitchcock, is a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece of filmmaking and an incredible masterpiece of editing. It also shocked audiences at the time, and not just because of the brutal violence, but because the main character of the film, so far, is suddenly and brutally killed, something not done before in movies. Now, Roland is often the first or one of the first investigators that most will play, and we know that it's almost assured that the first time around your investigator will succumb to the mental or physical trauma at the hands of the Gathering, and most likely the hands of the Ghoul Priest, or in the case of Roland, perhaps at the hands of some rotting remains. Now, doomed protagonists are common in Lovecraft. His fiction is full of them, like poor old Walter Gilman in Dreams of the Witch House. Now, a doomed protagonist, as defined, say, in tvtropes.com, is the story almost always ends just short of his or her final transformation or death, and sometimes begins with a later scene that shows him or her doomed. It is also almost always told from the first person. These stories are usually apocalyptic logs. But Roland operates closer to Eddard Stark and Marion Crane. Just as we invest in them and their story, they die or go insane. It's almost inevitable Roland will die or be defeated by horror early and quickly on a first run. So what is Roland teaching us about the game? Well, a lot. He's telling us that death is inevitable, the narrative is unpredictable, that you have no control, that your expectations are pointless, and that your characters are powerless, essential ingredients in any horror narrative. So Roland plays an important role in the game for many. Like Lita, he operates as a teacher, not only in terms of how investigators work and how their statistics and abilities interface with each other and the game system, but importantly, Roland teaches the player to accept death, disability and insanity as an integral part of the game, to expect to feel powerless and out of control most of the time, and to accept that things are most likely doomed. In this way, Roland is teaching players the core themes of Lovecraftian horror, without the need for new players to read any of the novels. This game is not a power fantasy, Roland is saying as he stares at you and dares you to follow him into the abyss. So here we are. What's my verdict on Roland? Here we have Roland Banks, knight-errant and federal agent, a very popular investigator and one who is both flexible within solo and multiplayer formats. His abilities mean that he rewards straightforward synergistic gameplay where action, economy and defeating enemies progresses the act deck efficiently and effectively. Importantly, he represents honesty and belief in the rules-based order both within the game world but also in terms of the game itself. He's also a teacher. As a doomed protagonist, he teaches new players some of the most important themes and ideas within the Lovecraftian universe. So, I think Roland deserves huge accolades. I must say I didn't come to this work with expectations that I would appreciate Roland as much as I do now. He really deserves to be seen as iconic as Harvey Walters, and I sincerely hope you agree. Maybe it's time to break him out for your next campaign. What do you think? So there it is. I'd like to thank you, the viewer, for watching my analysis. I welcome comments and thoughts. A special thanks goes to Fantasy Flight Games, from which most of the images here were sourced. And a special thanks goes to Vase Odin and his channel Twisted Tentacle Inn, Nate Lost in Time and Space, Winging It, Pure Flight and Kevling for their thoughts on Roland. Please check out their channels. Their content is amazing. Vase and Nate are also on the Great Old Ones podcast, and links to all this excellent content is in the notes. Special thanks goes to Andy Cotgreave for his awesome data analysis video. Check out his YouTube page, and to all the Arkham Horror the Living Card Game Facebook people who voted and made comments about Roland. I also referenced these 3 books in my video: The Dirge of Reason by Graham Davis, The Investigators of Arkham Horror, edited by Katrina Ostrander for Fantasy Flight Games, and the Fantasy Flight Games Rulebook and How to Play book. Please note, I paid for and own physical and digital copies of these texts. Finally, once again, a big thanks to all of you, the viewers. Thanks to your overwhelming response to my Gathering in-depth video, I made another. This time I hope I got the audio a bit better balanced. We'll see. I love doing these videos and I plan to do some more. What do you think? What would you like me to tackle next? I'm very interested to hear your feedback. Until then, I'm Krabby Terror 8. Thank you once again for watching. and goodbye.